I am Ross Sandler, Professor of Law and Director of the Center for New York City Law. Thank you for attending and for making the CityLaw Breakfast an important public forum. First, I want to thank our three generous and loyal founding sponsors of the CityLaw Breakfast series. They are Consolidated Edison, Verizon, and the law firm of Greenberg Traurig. I also want to thank the Gold Star contributors who voluntarily contribute when they sign up to attend the breakfast. The names of these Gold Star contributors are listed after every breakfast in the email that the center sends out with the link to the video following the breakfast. We are enormously grateful for this financial support, which makes these breakfasts possible. Today's speaker is Kathryn Wylde, who will speak on New York's post-pandemic prospects. After her prepared remarks, we will have a question and comment session, as we always do. We encourage you to submit a question or a comment at any time during the breakfast. We collect the questions as they come in, and then we'll ask them and collect them after we've taken them in. To submit a question or comment, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. We ask that you please identify yourself with your first and last name and your organization. Following the Q&A session, we will close the breakfast with a short colloquy between Kathryn Wylde and Dean Anthony Crowell. Kathryn Wylde has been a major force in New York City for more than 40 years. Kathryn Wylde was born in Madison, Wisconsin, graduated from St. Olaf College, and came to New York City in 1968. She early worked on housing, community development, and preservation, and moved to the Partnership for New York City in 1981 to work on housing. She was the first employee of the partnership, which had been founded 2 years earlier in 1979. For the last 20 years, she's been president of the partnership. Her opinions are sought on every important public issue, whether it be housing, taxes, the budget, education, infrastructure, or the economy generally. She supported congestion pricing, been a strong advocate for public transit, and urged acceptance of the Amazon proposal for Long Island City. I worked with her most recently when we both served on the BQE expert panel, where she was a voice for urgency and a sound reconstruction plan. Now, as we begin to emerge from the pandemic, her voice is one of the major voices that will influence how New York City regains its vitality. New York Law School is honored to welcome Kathryn Wylde to the City Law Breakfast Forum. Kathryn, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ross. I'm delighted to be here and join with you. I know the commitment that you and Anthony and the law school has to New York City. And I want to start with sort of the punchline. I have great confidence in the long-term future of New York City. I think we will remain the world's greatest city and center of commerce. The question is how long recovery takes and what we have to go through to get there, and how much suffering people will experience in the meantime if we don't put in place a solid recovery plan that engages both the private as well as the public sector. So I'm going to cover sort of 3 points. Number one, the economic implications of the COVID. Number two, the political complications that our current political environment. First thing about the economic implications is that the pandemic did not have the major impact on, I just got to notice that my internet's unstable. If you lose me, let me know. I'm in Puerto Rico for the Easter week. So the economic implications of the COVID were not as consequential as originally feared. Remember, back in June, we were projecting a 13% decline in the city's gross economic output. In fact, it turned out to be in 2020, despite the pandemic lasting a lot longer than we thought it would, it turned out to be between maybe 3 and 5%. The fact is that the companies, the global companies in New York, our headquarters operations, had experienced the pandemic early on in China and then in Europe, and they were prepared to transfer immediately to remote work. and to adopt the protocols that were necessary. They were, so our financial services industry, our professional services industry, the technology sector, the media sector, global leadership that knew what they were doing and were quick to respond and really kept our economy going. Transferred to remote work almost instantly, and were there. In fact, they dipped into their resources, their reserves that they had for emergencies, and they were supplying the hospitals with the and the emergency services with the PPE, the equipment and the masks that they had in their warehouses all over the country. They were donating those early on, so they were prepared and for any disaster. And when it came, they were ready. And as a result, our economy at a macro level stayed strong throughout the pandemic. Our tax rolls did not plummet. We did not end up with a fiscal crisis. We had some losses, which have been made up, more than made up by federal funding. So in that sense, we did pretty well. The impact of the COVID, however, was very targeted. And so it was targeted at the brick and mortar economy that was not online. It was small business, it was retail, obviously travel and tourism, the airlines, the hotels, something you might not think about, the cosmetics industry. We have several major global cosmetics companies. The fashion industry all became victims of the stay-at-home COVID era. So there were selective losses, and we lost in New York City a net of about 626,000 jobs, which is more than we gained in the past decade of growth. And we have today an unemployment rate that's double the nation's, still almost 13%. At the same time, we have, as of February, we have, or as of March, actually, we have 316,000 open job postings, which is more than we've had any time since January of 2020. Meaning we've got job activity and job growth going on. We don't have the people to fill them. The people who are out of work do not have the skills for the jobs. 93% of the jobs that list an educational requirement require more than a high school degree. So we've got a whole new sector. I guess the overwhelming implication is that the COVID accelerated by probably 10 to 20 years the rise of the digital economy. And so those companies, those businesses that were plugged in to the digital economy pre-COVID have done fine. Those that were not have been devastated. And that's sort of the challenge that we have going forward, is how do we both prepare people for the jobs that are open and available, and also support the transition of those businesses that are not ready for a digital economy, support their transition. So let me go now to the political implications, and obviously starting with the $212 million budget that the state has just enacted. Did I say million? Billion, $212 billion budget. It's 22.5% higher than our budget of 2 years ago. So this is a huge increase in spending, the largest in our state's history. And to pay for that, they have raised taxes by about $3.5 billion a year, primarily the personal income tax and the corporate tax. And it has made us the #1 highest taxed city and state in the country, with a city resident having a PIT tax rate. The top tax rate is now 14.7%. The result of that is that we are going to face a real challenge. And I know people are skeptical about, well, will people leave New York because of taxes? The truth is that people have already left New York, not just because of taxes, but for lots of reasons. But taxes obviously play a factor, and particularly, and the reason this is a political, not an economic issue, is that the city and state did not need to raise taxes this year, but there was an overwhelming drumbeat to tax the rich, make those who did well during the pandemic because of market performance and because of their own performance, the financial industry in particular, which has produced such great results and fueled our tax rolls, make them pay and support those who have suffered. And that's an okay concept, but the problem is that since there is no real, since the federal government, thank you, Senator Schumer, had produced $100 billion in support for New York, both closing the city and state fiscal deficits, the MTA deficits, but also providing huge resources for the Broadway stages, for restaurants, for small business. The PPP grants in the loans that recover, forgivable loans, effectively grants, that the federal government has put out so far since the COVID began have been a very important factor in New York. 240,000 loans have been made to small businesses and nonprofits, equal to some 27 billion investment in our economy. So that's been a very important piece. And there's now a new round of, as I say, $100 billion in stimulus that's becoming available. So these are, so the taxes as punishment is not a good message to send. We created a millionaire's tax in 2009. It was a temporary couple-year tax. Governor Cuomo came in and said, if I'm gonna make pension reform, I've got to extend that tax. The business community actually supported the extension of the millionaire's tax at that time. It became part of a permanent rate. We have a very progressive tax system, contrary to the popular notion or the claim that some make that we don't have a very progressive tax system. In fact, the top 5% of earners, tax filers in our state are responsible for 60% of our tax revenues. The New York City metro area downstate is responsible for 91% of the state's income tax revenues. So we are definitely doing our share, and a lot of this comes out of the financial services industry and the professional services industry, which is the lawyers, accountants, et cetera. And those are the two industries that are most threatened going forward, and that we should be paying attention to what's required to keep them here. Prior to the COVID, and this is sort of non-going into prospects for the future, prior to the COVID, our fastest area of growth was in the tech sector, but it was still only about 8% of the New York City economy. Since the COVID, I don't know if you can hear the dogs barking here, but I can. So since the COVID, the expansion of tech, as I said before, the digital economy has accelerated by leaps and bounds. And so you've got companies that have done very well. You know, Amazon is number 2 now as the largest employer in New York City after only JP Morgan Chase. They got here one way or the other. I guess that's good news. I certainly think it's good news. But in addition, you've got Peloton, a New York City startup, which has done terrific. You've got Fresh Direct, which has done terrific. So there's been these implications for the acceleration of the tech sector that have actually done very well in New York City. But again, we go back to the fact that that's created a lot of jobs, not just in tech and computer, which is where many of them are, but also in marketing and sales, other areas, other professional areas where we have jobs that we do not have people in need, people who are unemployed, prepared to take those jobs. And that's the big challenge going forward. If we can meet that challenge, we'll be far along the way to building a far more equitable economy and toward an economic recovery that is positive. But that's an immediate challenge. Retaining the financial and professional services industry. Financial services, securities alone is 20% of our tax base and about the same of our economy. If we can retain those sectors, that's a very big challenge, and that's where the concerns about tax increases come in, because it falls very heavily on those sectors. If we can retain that talent pool, that's very important. Right now, we just finished a most recent survey of Manhattan office employers, and only 10% of the Manhattan's 1 million office workers are back in the office at this point. Again, originally, when we first polled this last May, the anticipation was that half the workforce would be back in the office by Labor Day 2020. That did not happen, as you know. And so we're now kind of stuck at a plateau where we actually got up to about 15% in the fall, but now it's down to 10%. And it's probably permanently going to be impacted by remote work. People are demanding more flexibility. Those that are remained in New York City are demanding the flexibility to work from home on some days. That's going to have an impact on obviously our public transit system and their revenues. And it's a serious concern that we have to plan for, but there are real advantages and potential advantages of diversifying our economy more geographically, both within the city, the 5 boroughs, and regionally. So we have jobs that are closer to where people live. And that is something that will precipitate growth and create more integrated economies. In addition, a dog just joined me, sorry. Please go away. There are also some, so the office return to work is a concern. It's anticipated, again, our tourism and travel industry is going to be affected. People have really cut back on business travel. It's basically been non-existent during the COVID. Business travel is a very important part of our tourism industry. And business travel is expected to be down as much as 50% going forward for the foreseeable future. That has an impact on our cultural institutions, obviously our hotel industry. Business travelers are big spenders, big restaurant goers. So that's a significant issue. And so we've got to think about, okay, what are the incentives to bring people back? Obviously having a safe city, a secure city, a clean city, and demonstrating that these sectors, the corporate sector, is welcome in New York. We've got a mayoral election coming up, and I think the messaging that comes out of that from whoever is elected the next mayor will be critical to the recovery, to encouraging industries to come back. And again, I mentioned earlier that 56% of our highest taxpayers are not residents. They're non-resident taxpayers. So they've got a job here, but they live elsewhere. Increasingly, those non-residents, as taxes go up in New York, particularly those who are in Florida, where there's a real concentration of the financial services and professional services industry, they're demanding that their business open business operations so that they can work out of a Florida office and not pay the non-resident personal income taxes in New York. So it's not companies that are planning to leave. It's not headquarters that are planning to relocate. It is talent, both existing talent and people that they're trying to attract, who are saying, we demand that our workplace either be not entirely remote, but that you set up offices where where the new concentrations of talent are. And right now that's happening in Austin, in Miami, in Palm Beach, North Carolina to some extent, the Washington, DC area to some extent, where they've really got the welcome mat out and are competing intensively. Even New Jersey has created new incentive packages to compete for New York City-based business operations. And that's the real threat. On the other hand, we have some huge assets. Look at Pfizer having become the first company to develop a vaccine. They've been in New York City since 1849, did their first plant here, produced penicillin out of it. A century later, produced Viagra out of it. Pfizer has been really a key element of diversifying our economy, a manufacturer that chose to stay here and keep their headquarters here when a lot of others left in the 70s and 80s. And they represent the pharmaceutical industry, but out of that has grown a tremendous life science industry cluster that both the state and the city in the last 4 years have invested heavily in supporting. And our medical research, our health industry, our life sciences industry has seen growth throughout the pandemic. Venture capital has tripled in terms of investment in life sciences. So this is a real positive area of hope. And there are lots of others in the innovation economy where New York, because of our great universities and research institutions, is a global leader on many fronts. So all very positive. The concerns is, will we politically make it difficult? I was very disappointed that the conversation, the political conversation, the legislative conversation over the budget in the past year did not focus on jobs. Almost the entire focus was conversations about taxes. And can we do a stock transfer tax and destroy the trading industry? Can we do a wealth tax and chase out the billionaires? That dominated the conversation. We've got to switch that conversation to talk about how do we do the job, get back the jobs? How do we prepare people for those jobs? This will require investment. New Yorkers are used to paying taxes. They value investment in the city, but they don't like it as punishment. So let me wrap up there and end by saying, again, I'm optimistic about the future of the city. I don't think we want it to take as long as it took us to recover. I saw the decline of the city in the 70s and 80s, and it took us 30 years to bounce back, to regain the million lost people, et cetera. It took us a long time. And that I am very concerned that we not have a 30-year recovery track. This should be a 3-year recovery track if we work together. Thank you.
Well, that was a terrific putting together of all the issues, and I hope that we get good questions and comments. I'm now going to turn it over to Associate Director of the Center, Brian Kasub, who's been collecting the questions and comments, and we move on to that important part of this program. Brian?
Thank you, Professor Sandler, and thank you, Kathryn Wylde, for joining us today. Before we get to the Q&A, just want to let our audience know that the Center for City Law, the Law and Leadership Institute, and at New York Law School will be hosting a series of conversations with mayoral candidates starting next Wednesday on April 14th and again on April 28th. Dean Crowell and student leaders will be interviewing one-on-one with our mayoral candidates, and we hope that you can join us. To come, you can RSVP at www.nyls.edu/event RSVP. And we hope that you can join us at these mayoral forums. If you're on our City Law distribution list, we'll send out more invitations about this early next week. So we have several good questions, and please continue submitting your questions and state your name. The first question comes from George Bulrow, President of Interactive International Incorporated. And he says, there seems to be some disconnect between what the people currently running for citywide office are talking about and promising to voters versus the real financial crunch on the city's finances, starting in year 2 and going forward. What should we expect to hear from the candidates to address this subject?
Well, that's an interesting point. I did not mention the real estate issues. And I think that since the city depends so heavily on real estate tax revenues for its fiscal viability. And clearly in terms of the commercial real estate, the values have dropped substantially, and residential in some areas as well. So the tax base of the city that the city depends on in terms of the real estate tax base, you're absolutely right, portends a future fiscal crisis once the federal funds are exhausted. So I think that it is a legitimate fiscal concern. The big numbers in the city budget are related to people, and we have in the last, under the de Blasio administration, we've increased the size of city government substantially, something like 20%, and we've got a lot more people. That implies the fastest growing area of the city budget for years has been in health benefits for people, and it's one of those areas where one of the last places left where there's no copay requirement on healthcare. So I think you're absolutely right that some of those reforms are going to have to take place, because while we don't have a fiscal crisis today, thanks to federal assistance and Wall Street doing very well, if anything happens, as our tax base is very, very volatile, especially the personal income tax base. And we can expect that there are going to be some dramatic changes in the next few years, including reduction in real estate taxes, and I believe reduction in personal income taxes, that we're going to see losses as people react to these tax increases. So that combination suggests that you're absolutely right. The next mayor should be telling us how they're going to use, hopefully, technology, hopefully homegrown technology, to make government more efficient and less expensive.
Great. Our next question is coming from Stanley Schuman, who happens to be the chair of the City Law Advisory Committee and a longtime supporter of the center in New York Law School. Why should free agents sign with our professional sports teams, given the large tax differential of competitive franchises?
Hi, Stan. A good friend. You make the point. I don't have to, it is a good question, and it's unclear why, because they can live anywhere. We have right now, whether it's the top talent in the sports or financial industry, the theater industry, we have to reconcentrate that talent in New York. They're all over the world. They're all over the place because of the pandemic. And we have to get them back here. And that's going to be a challenge, just like with the office workers. And in the first instance, it's a health challenge. And I've got to say the state and the city are doing everything that could be done to make sure that we adequately meet the health challenge. They're doing a terrific job on that. But after the health challenge, hopefully by the time we're all vaccinated this summer, we'll be beyond immediate threats of the pandemic, and we can turn to the economic challenge. And that is going to require much more thoughtful public policy, particularly with regard to taxes and spending.
Great. Our next question is from James Parrott. Do you support high income and corporate tax increases at the national level to pay for needed infrastructure investments, both physical and investments in the care infrastructure?
Well, personally, I think it's going to be necessary. Obviously, the infrastructure investment is extremely important for New York. The Biden plan will be negotiated. It involves a lot more than physical infrastructure, which is, of course, a top priority here. We need the Gateway Tunnel and other things. So and it's been pretty clear throughout the campaign, President Biden was elected on a commitment for raising the revenues necessary to fill some of these needs. So I believe that the partnership will ultimately support a balanced approach, because we believe in the kind of investment that's required going forward, but we have not formally taken that position yet.
Next question is from Jonathan Ling. How significantly will the increase in crime affect both the tourism sector and the return to office in New York City?
Well, we haven't had the increase in crime and violent crime has not yet reached anything like what we had in the 80s. So the key is to get ahead of it. I think Commissioner Shea has done a good job of focusing on what the issues are, explaining them to the public. We've got a new police reform plan for police community relations that hopefully will bring us all back together again so that police morale is improves and communities are working together with the police. So I think we're on the right track now after a pretty bad year and a difficult year for all concerned, but I think we're on the right track now to restore the mutual respect between the police and community that kept our city safe and made it much safer over the last 20, 30 years. Back in the early 80s, the partnership saw crime as the #1 reason that jobs and businesses were leaving the city. That was the crack epidemic, et cetera. Started a program called Crime Stoppers, the 577 tips that got communities to start reporting where trouble was happening, and that resulted in much improved relations at the time between the communities and police. I think we've got to resurrect that kind of cooperative relationship, and hopefully we're on track to do that. There is no way to restore our tourism industry or to maintain our economy if crime gets out of hand again.
Our next question is from Thomas Lopez Pierre. What do we do with the millions of Black and Hispanic people with regards to employment that do not have a college education, considering New York City's population is 52% Black and Hispanic? Do we invest in more?
Thank you, Thomas. Yes, what we have to do, #1, is review, and many of our large employers are doing this. New York has been able to attract people with bachelor's degrees and higher to jobs that don't require that kind of training, that could require a community college degree or even a technical credential. We didn't pay attention to really focusing on how do we reduce job requirements to what they really are, to make sure that we're not forcing everybody to be an Ivy League college graduate to get a job in New York. So that's been a very important shift that's taken place over the past few years. CUNY has been a leader in that area in trying to advocate for that effort. And most of the kids graduating from our public schools that are going on to college at the city university system, the partnerships that are being created between CUNY and the employers around apprenticeships, around credentialing, around changing job criteria to reflect one, starting jobs having a minimum requirement, but then allowing people to do apprenticeships and continue their education while they're working so that they can come out with the ability to have upward mobility. Those are the goals of that program. I think the key is now, like with everything in New York City, you cannot do this on a boutique basis. You have to be able to scale it, because unless we get real numbers, it doesn't matter. The partnership with CUNY and with our other universities, PACE and others that are training our New York City residents, I think is the answer here, and their partnership with employers. For too long, I think that we had silos where educators were in one, employers were the other, and never the twain shall meet. That has changed dramatically, and I think the Black Lives Matter movement has helped accelerate that change. The COVID and the inequities exposed by the COVID has made that a top priority. Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan Chase is leading a jobs council that's staffed by Gail Mello, former president of LaGuardia Community College, that is working on this exact issue and committing 100,000 jobs to Black and Hispanic New Yorkers. So I think there's a very exciting effort underway to do that. And we've got to all push it because it has to scale.
Thank you. The next question is from Christopher Boylan. Where do you think congestion pricing now fits in the equation? Does it look like a punishment tax, and will it produce the kind of revenues anticipated in light of fewer people actually working in our two main CBDs?
Hi, Chris. It's a worry about the congestion pricing revenues. But on the other hand, I think the city is going to come back. Unfortunately, more people are driving. While the use of the subways and commuter rail has gone down, the vehicular traffic has not depreciated that much. So we have an opportunity now, as we come out of the COVID, to introduce both improvements, modernization, health improvements in the mass transit system, which is going on, and they're doing a great job of, and at the same time, discourage vehicular use within the central business district, and for that matter, throughout the city, because traffic is a problem. There's a great plan that's been advocated by Transportation Alternatives for increasing the amount of street space that is committed to both pedestrians, maintaining the outdoor restaurants, and also protected bike lanes, and specifically bike and bus lanes. And I think that congestion pricing will in fact work as a complement to that. Quality of life issues have become much more important to New Yorkers, top of mind. It's not just crime, but the quality of life, the quality of street life, the ability to bike to work, whatever. I think that those factors are going to make congestion pricing more important. And there's some flexibility in terms of how they charge, how they raise the revenues. If in fact it becomes, we did a study a few years ago, it's like 20 billion a year in lost productivity for business and the economy in the city as a result of excess traffic congestion. It is worth a lot to business and to those who are trying to navigate the city with vehicles, with deliveries, et cetera. It's worth a lot to them to have more open streets, more available parking. And if we can achieve that balance, I think congestion pricing revenues will in fact be strong.
Great. Our next question is from Ron Richter. Thank you so much, Kathryn, for this rich presentation. Would you comment on the importance of the nonprofit business sector in the recovery? One, how they may leverage the support of job development, and whether you think the public and for-profit business sectors acknowledge sufficiently the role of the nonprofit sector and how they should and can play.
Hey, Ron. Thanks for that question. And I didn't focus on the nonprofit sector, which is obviously critical. I was glad to see in the budget that some of the workforce of the human services sector is going to get some increased pay as a result of the budget, and that's certainly a good news. I think, and that it's a focus in terms of caregiving in the federal funding programs as well, and infrastructure programs. The nonprofit sector has enormous value proven during the pandemic, where they continue to deliver services, and where you all shifted to being able to deliver telemedicine, but also had people out in the streets working at food pantries and elsewhere. So thank you for what you have done to support those communities that could not support themselves through this effort, through this pandemic. Going forward, I really think that we've got to do much more integration of health and human services and not have so many silos in that regard. And that as we think about that, as health has become a new level of consciousness and priority for this country, we have to start with thinking about, from the federal government on down, how funding streams have to support the integration of these efforts. And a very important part of that is workforce support and development. So I think you're right on in focusing on that. And it's certainly something that the business community needs to recognize. I had a conversation yesterday with leadership of one of the major hospitals that's looking at this very issue and the whole question of the social determinants of health, how education, job, employment have the biggest impact. Is like 80% of health outcomes result not from healthcare issues, but from other social determinant issues. And this is something that only the nonprofit sector is in a position to address. And I think that this has become clear that one of the silver linings of the COVID is that there's much more recognition of the connectivity of these issues. And and I think that the nonprofit sector, if they make their case appropriately, and the Human Services Council is working on that, part of an effort that that Ron and I are both part of, I think that that is going to make a big impact.
Great. Our next question is from Rich Leamsider. Thank you very much, Kathryn. I could not agree more about the focus on jobs for New Yorkers. Given that companies came through this past year much better than expected, but we simultaneously lost 10 years of jobs, especially among the least secure New Yorkers, what are some good ideas or best practices to encourage companies to create jobs now and better retaining jobs during future crises?
Well, during this crisis, the job loss, the least job loss was government. That's the industry that laid off the fewest people. Financial services was number 2. So our big industries basically retained their jobs and retained their people, albeit working remotely. So Manhattan offices are empty, but those people are still on payroll. The problem has been with those businesses that depend, mostly small businesses, and that depend on foot traffic, and obviously the travel and tourism areas that were simply shut down by government fiat. So I think in terms of best practices, during the last year, industries like the human services industry, but also the cultural institutions, the restaurant and hospitality industry, the hotel industry, the chambers of commerce in all 5 boroughs, they've really gotten their act together and done a very good analysis of what public policies are required for them to recover. And they have made the case. An example is for the neighborhood retail sectors, getting them online, getting them web enabled, for example. So there are plans that have been developed over the last year, thank you, Zoom, by all the industry sectors in the city. And I think it's bringing those together and making sure that the city administration, government administration, the state administration, the incoming elected government for next year, that they hear the plans that these sectors have come up with and the policy recommendations they've come up with, and then try and incorporate those into thinking about public policy going forward. And then figure out what they're going to cost and how we're going to raise the revenues to support them. But I think the key here is that we're in a position, as we were in the 70s and 80s, where the government didn't have resources. It really came out of communities, out of industry, out of public-private partnerships, the ideas, the plans, Many of the resources came ground up, not top down from government. And I think we can set up, if we can set up a process, and by we, I'm talking about everybody, and have a government that's receptive to hearing the ideas and the good thinking that has come out of this, of the work done during the pandemic, I think that we will have a much better public policy agenda that can unite New York, and we can all work together on.
Great. Our next question is from Jeffrey Crossler. There's a frightening vacancy rate in commercial real estate today, and businesses are rethinking their need for space. In that context, there is a pending plan to build 4.5 million square feet of commercial space on Governor's Island, and Governor Cuomo has put $1.3 billion in the budget to foster new office towers around Penn Station. Should these go forward, or should we rethink big development?
Well, the Governor's Island proposal is a city proposal that has to do with trying to create an environmental center, and certainly the whole issue, the set of issues surrounding climate change are totally related to the resilience movement that is so important to New York City. I mean, we've been focused on health resilience, but it's very tied to the climate change. So I think those are two different examples. One is a public initiative. It is going to require private resources to get done because the city's not going to be able to finance it. So it will be a combination of efforts in terms of supporting Governor's Island as a center for environmental and climate work. If that can happen, I think that's a great thing. I think that, and in terms of the Penn Station proposal, again, that's going to require private resources, especially the way the budget is written, to happen. The markets will have to respond. It's going to depend. It can't happen in a vacuum in the current market. It can't happen because you won't be able to attract the private financing. And I think the same is true of development generally. So it's going to be a matter of timing. I don't think these are projects that are going to roar ahead in the absence of a private market recovery. And we don't know the timing of that right now.
Great. We're going to take one more question from the audience, and then we're going to have invite Dean Anthony Crowell to ask some questions. This question is coming from Phoebe. Other than tax incentives, what can New York City do to get back professional talent, tech, and financial from other cities such as Austin and Miami?
Well, I think the first thing, obviously, is we have to show we're a healthy and safe city. And a lot is going on in that regard. The state announced 2 weeks ago, the Excelsior, I think it was 2 weeks ago, hard to remember now, the Excelsior Vaccine Pass, which is an app that everybody will be able to have on their phone, demonstrating that they are vaccinated against the COVID. That's an important step forward, that when we have that, you can create safe venues. So I think the first thing that people are concerned about when we survey what are the concerns about coming back to the office, health is the #1 concern. The safety and health of public transit is the #2 concern. 80+% of office workers depend on public transit, commuter rail, subways, buses to come back. They want to make sure they're healthy and safe. So that's got to be our first focus. And I think if we can get that right, we'll be in good shape. 2 is the predictability of schools being open, and so that families know that they can come back and relocate. A lot of decisions about coming back to New York depends on the education, the predictability of the education system, and the quality of the education system. So that's a second major area. As mentioned before, not allowing crime to get out of control is another major consideration. And I think in general, the messaging that New York, the leadership of New York, is going to listen to the concerns of the residents, of the businesses, and forge public policy that's not based on ideology, but is based on real human needs.
Great, thank you for our questions from the audience, and those who we didn't get to, we can still share those questions, with Kathryn. It's the beauty of Zoom and submitting them online. We'll make sure that those questions get submitted so she can see what you're asking. And now I'd like to invite Dean Anthony Crowell up to the virtual podium to ask a question and have a little closing conversation with Kathryn. Dean Crowell.
Hi, Kathy. Thanks so much again for being here. Your remarks have been tremendous and really, I think, not only helpful, but very thought-provoking as well. One of the things that has been on my mind is what is the blueprint for higher ed? And I appreciate you bringing up the role that higher ed has in workforce development. And we're talking about workforce development on a number of levels. But if we were to look at a blueprint for higher ed and its impact on the economy, where would you start on building on workforce development, but also those public-private partnerships that we've seen to be really powerful in recent years?
Well, I think that higher ed increasingly has to focus on sort of the practical side of their mission. We have had over the last couple decades a big focus on research, on innovation, much less so on vocational preparation. And I use that word deliberately. It's an old-fashioned word, but it means getting people prepared for a job. And so I think that involves a kind of infrastructure that we really don't have. We don't have a matching system that analyzes labor market needs, plugs into the educational system, and then and matches people with employers and curriculum with employers. We've got lots of little programs that do that. But as I said before, in New York, unless it's done at scale and unless it's systemic, we're not going to see much happen. And we've argued for a long time that we've got the technology available to have a system that that really integrates higher ed, K through 12, actually starting with K through 12, higher ed, and the private sector business community and the nonprofit workforce development communities. That they should be as of one. We have federal funding that comes down through the Department of Labor that focuses on some workforce development. We've got higher education funding that comes down through the Higher Education Act and ignores vocational development. This stuff has to be integrated. I'm hoping that at the federal level, they'll start to understand that and put these pieces together. I mean, I think workforce development should be in the education department, or maybe in the commerce department. I don't think it should be in a department that regulates employers. It should be over in a department that prepares employees, prepares talent for the jobs that are available. So that's my suggestion on that.
That's great, very helpful. And in terms of partnerships with private sector, so I think about what happened on Roosevelt Island and with the Cornell Technion partnership. What kinds of partnerships should we look to potentially within the tech sector, but even beyond the tech sector? Because we have the ability to attract not just a domestic student population and research, but also international. And where should we be headed in terms of diversifying those kinds of global partnerships?
Well, the city is prioritizing now both public health and climate environment, wind, et cetera, as is the state. So I think those are the two priority areas that they're right to prioritize, and that can draw on the resources of the university community as at Cornell Tech, where they've got both private sector businesses actually working hand in glove with graduate students. So we can do a lot more of those kinds of relationships, and they will be required for any advancement on either the public health side or the environmental side. But also, we have a very large ed tech community in New York City, which has never been called upon or had an opportunity to work with the Department of Education. We haven't put the resources there. And in general, we are so underspending in government on technology. This came out with the state's unemployment system, where in order to make it function when the huge demand escalated from the federal unemployment, and they went from hundreds of people to millions of people on the application line, the call went out for COBOL programmers because the systems are so old.
Not integrated.
And Google came in and saved them and built an overlay in a matter of a couple of days. Now, Google's one of our largest and fastest growing employers. They have a real stake in New York and in our markets. And they were able to very quickly bridge a gap that helped get those unemployment checks out. We've got to be using, whether it's in ed tech or it's in how government is run, or we have a partnership with the MTA and DOT and the other transportation agencies on bringing private sector innovation to the MTA from something other than the 3-year public procurement process. So I think there's lots of opportunity there. Again, this is an area that's going to require investment by the public sector, but I think it's an area that will pay off, because this is, if we can deploy, and this will attract, before there was a question about how do we attract tech talent here and tech entrepreneurs here. If we turned our public budget into a sandbox that is looking for the best innovation in the world and bringing it in to help government be more efficient and more effective in all our public agencies, we're in a great position to do that, and we've never done it.
Yeah, sounds like a ripe area, certainly for a new mayoral administration to look at, working with the state and obviously with assistance from the federal government to really drive that. And I love the structural approaches you're talking about in terms of the different departments that have responsibility for labor, incentivizing workforce development, and overall how we can grow the tech sector and be more thoughtful about an integrated approach. Let me ask you a couple of things that haven't been mentioned, I don't think. SALT reform. And when I hear and talk about in recent weeks what's going on with our tax structure in New York State, I have to think about the impact that the SALT changes a few years ago had on New York State and New York City in particular. What's your prognosis for SALT reform and timeline?
Well, I think that Senator Schumer is certainly committed to it. We had, for SALT reform, is state and local tax deductibility. For those of you who don't know, it existed for 100 years. It was capped at $10,000 per taxpayer by the Tax Reform Act of 2017. It was at a savings of somewhere around $90 billion to the federal government. But in turn, New York, which was the most impacted by SALT reform, it affected the high tax states. And the high tax states are not gratuitously raising taxes because they want to. They are the states that represent the heart of our economy. So they have the biggest infrastructure costs. They have the most low-income people and needs. They have the big urban centers. These are the states that need strong state and local taxes to supplement what they get from the federal government. It's not well understood that these states are all donor states to the federal government. We send more to Washington than we get back. But because of SALT, our high earner taxpayers, starting in 2018, are sending $12 billion more to the federal treasury than they were before. So their taxes have already gone up substantially. And reversing SALT, restoring state and local tax deductibility would be a substantial benefit to the taxpayers of New York. Whether it's going to happen depends on the negotiations in Washington. Unfortunately, the way Washington works, we do not have a majority of states that care about this issue, because we have it's limited to about a dozen states where this is an important issue. So it's unclear politically. I don't want to make a political prognosis on it. We certainly think that Senator Schumer is going to be an important voice in this effort.
And one final question, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is the issue of immigration reform and its impact on the economy.
Thank you for bringing that up. I meant to, our prospects for recovery, our source of population growth has always been foreign immigration in New York, and then we populate the country. We will not recover without immigration reform, and that's both path to citizenship for the probably 800,000 undocumented that live in New York, but also the H-1Bs and the education visas and the ability of graduate students to stay here. This is extremely important, and there is probably no single more important federal policy for our economic recovery than immigration reform. So thank you for mentioning that.
I'm glad we were able to get that out there. I agree. And it's, so much, there's so much on the agenda, and it's so, I mean, there always has been, but it's particularly weighty given the backdrop and the implications of what we're staring down. So thank you so much for this absolutely spectacular talk. And we really are very grateful for all your time. Ross, do you want to come and offer some very final remarks?
Yes. I want to thank you all. I was sitting here listening to all of the questions, particularly the questions from the audience, and then the colloquy. And I was thinking just how sophisticated this conversation has been, and the knowledge that Kathryn Wylde brings to this. The range of topics was really extreme, maybe more than we've ever had. And I really appreciate that you were willing to share your thoughts with us. This has been a very important breakfast for all of us. And I thank you so much for being with us and for what you're doing for New York City. Let us hope that there are a large audience listening and that many of these good ideas will come to fruition in a few years. Thank you so much. And thank the audience. We will be back again with another breakfast very shortly. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.